So today we're going to be kind of getting some background information about the book that we're getting ready to read called Out of Darkness. And the book itself is centered around this explosion that happens, but it's set in Texas in the 1930s. And racism kind of dictates every event that happens, and as the book goes along, that happens more and more and more. So I felt like it was important to get some historical context for that, just so that we're all aware of the situation that was happening and what was going on and how factual this book really is, even though these characters are fictional. So our objectives for today are going to be that students will begin to identify and make connections to prior knowledge about racism in the 1930s, and students will begin to understand and write about how racism influences characters and storylines in Out of Darkness. So we may not write about Out of Darkness today because we haven't started reading it yet, but we will get there. So what I wanted to have you guys do is fill out a concept map on what you know about either racism in general or racism specifically involving Mexican Americans or specifically in Texas. And I wanted to do a concept map because I felt like it is an easier way for you all to list what you know visually. That wasn't a boring list, it has fun shapes on it. So I was going to share with you guys what I put on my concept map, and it is up here for you guys to see. So we have racism in the middle, which is a happy, lovely topic of conversation. So I tried to fill this out as though I hadn't already read the book, but I think that it did influence some of the things that I put on here because I learned some of those things from reading the book. So my first one up here was that lynching was a popular practice in many places around the U.S. during the 20th century. Does anybody know what the word lynching means? Before we move on. Don't know? Okay, basically it means that white people would go and find, typically African Americans, sometimes it would be other people, and hang them publicly. And they usually made a big show about it, and everybody went to these events, and it was a big deal, and it was sort of treated like having a picnic. But you were watching someone be hanged, and it was a big time. So the second one that I have is racism still exists, although it is not as overt as it used to be. Does anybody know what overt means? No? Overt is just another word for openness. So racism still exists today, but no one is as open about it as they used to be. The third thing I have, which you cannot really see, there we go, is according to many white people, Mexican Americans were not as white as they were, but they were also not black either. So the protagonist of our book is a Mexican American, and in places where there was a large Mexican American population, sometimes they would have schools for those kids, and sometimes they wouldn't. So because this is happening still during segregation, the kids in this book, even though they're Mexican, they go to a white school because there's not a Mexican school where they live, and they're not as black as the black kids who go to the black school. So segregation in Texas still persisted in large scale until the 1970s, even though Brown versus Board happened in the 1950s to integrate schools. Texas said, we don't care, we're still going to segregate our schools, and there were several laws that were passed after into the 1960s and 70s to integrate the schools. My fifth thing is that interracial relationships were not permitted during this period between anybody, between blacks and whites, or Mexican Americans and white people, or Mexican Americans and black people, or Asians and white people, or anybody, you name it, it wasn't allowed. And my final thing is that Hispanic children were sometimes allowed to go to white schools if there was not a school specifically for them, which I already said. Oh, sorry, there was one more. My last one, which you cannot see up here, is in Texas and other places with a large Mexican American population, racism affected more than just African Americans. And I think that's important for this book because sometimes all we know about racism has to do with African Americans, but it didn't just affect them. So I just wanted to give you guys some ideas for things that you can fill out. So take a couple minutes to fill yours out, fill out what you know. It can be anything. If you want to use these answers, you can. Try to paraphrase, don't just say what I said. And I'm going to be coming around and circulating around. I'm still circulating. You're doing a great job. That's a good answer. Nice going. wonderful.
So racism is the same as prejudice, right?
Kind of. Prejudice is more acting on those feelings of racism.
Okay.
So if you were prejudiced towards someone, you would maybe, I'm trying to think of like a modern example, say that you were prejudiced against people who had red hair, and you didn't let people who had red hair like sit with you at lunch or something, and that would be prejudice for people who had hair. So what we're gonna do now, I wanted to show you guys a video on a boy who was lynched in Texas. And this is happening a little bit before our book was written, but I thought it did a really good job kind of showing how horrific this really was.
James Allen has collected a photographic record of racial violence in the South.
Can you guys hear it okay?
For the past 20 years, he's found horrifying pictures in the family albums of ordinary Southern homes. Many are postcards that were mass-produced as souvenirs.
Some of these images were printed in the tens of thousands and sold for a dime or $1 a piece. Some of the postcards tell you where to write and the discounts you'll get if you buy 1, 10, or 100. They were sold in drugstores and pharmacies. They were sold on the street. I purchased a photograph from a woman. The photographer sold them door to door. Her mother bought the image for $2. A murder that is of particular interest to me was of a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jess Washington in Waco, Texas, in 1960. He was seriously mentally challenged. The wife of the farmer that he worked for was found dead. He was arrested. He was brought to trial. Trial took from 10 until 12. And when the jury came back at noon and found him guilty, someone in the courtroom, and it would have been anyone in the courtroom, screamed out, "Get that nigger." And one of the worst and cruelest treatments of a human being began. Jess was kicked down out of the courthouse, down the back steps where the crowd was several hundred people. They put a chain on his neck. There were 16,000 people crowding the street to watch this boy be tortured. Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree. The fire was started. They raised Jess from the fire up into the air so that the crowd could see. They were cheering like at a football game, cheering the torturers on. When Jess tried to climb up the chain, hand by hand, they cut his fingers off one by one, so that all he could do was slap the chain. They lowered him back down in the fire. A man came up and castrated him. Another man kept a pole so that he couldn't crawl out of the fire. And time and again, they pulled him up to keep him from dying so that the crowd could be satisfied. Until he finally died.
So I wanted to show you guys that video because I wanted you to kind of see the context of what was happening in the time that this book is set. And this is a little bit before, but I still think that it's really important to know that. So the last thing I'm going to do is read you just a brief paragraph from this article I found that involves Mexican Americans, because I couldn't really find any videos or anything like that on that because people don't really talk about it. And this is in a really long article written by the Texas Historical Society. And it says, newer Jim Crow laws in the early 20th century increased the segregation of the races, and in the cities, Black migrants from the rural areas joined their urban compatriots in ghettos. The laws ordinarily did not target Mexicans, but were enforced on the premise that Mexicans were an inferior and unhygienic people. Thus, Tejanos were relegated to separate residential areas or designated public facilities. Hispanics, although mostly Catholic in faith, worshipped at largely segregated churches. Blacks and Hispanics attended segregated and inferior color and Mexican schools. As late as the mid-1950s, the state legislature passed segregationist laws directed at blacks, and by implication to Tejanos. Some deal with education, others with residential areas and public accommodations. So I wanted to read that because there was really no law against Mexican American people, but it was all implied. So for the very last thing that I want us to do today, so I want you guys, after viewing the video and reading the article, I want you to take out a piece of paper and just predict how you think racism is going to come up in this book.